is this? What is this?
This was your great-grandfather's journal.
We talk of battles to be won, and here he comes like Don Juan. It's better than an opera.
I was born into a destitute family, enduring hardships of poverty. I was unable to enjoy the life of a noble boy and instead had to farm the noble's fields. It was impossible to escape poverty because of the continuous taxes we had to pay. When I was young, my mother would always curse the king that lived in Versailles.
I still had a child to feed, so I was thankful for this reform. I can't remember the last time.
It was always the same food and bread. That's all we could afford. We third estate people make up 97% of the French population. We are basically everything in the political order, but they treat us like nothing. The king uses the money for himself, and the government is always raising taxes for war money. We want equal representation, less taxation, and a bit more power. Is this too much to ask?
Ah, it's so good to be king.
And queen.
It was 1788. I was 28 years old and it was 1 year before the revolt started. Few people had already begun revolting. This year had been the worst year in 88 years because of hailstorms that made harvest difficult, and frozen rivers prevented the water wheels from powering the mills. This was devastating because bread is a staple food of France. Being cold and hungry, we wanted change and thus started revolting. The problem was that anyone who was suspected of plotting against the government or a revolt would be guillotined. The guillotine quickly changed from being a weapon of justice to a weapon of mass murder. By spring 1789, we, the Third Estate, made an attempt to make a change.
People want voting rights and freedom for the Third Estate.
We used the ideas of the Enlightenment to bring change to the voting process. The king locked us out of the meeting when we proclaimed ourselves as a new legislative council.
Out.
No, but just hear my ideas.
Get out.
Come on.
Get out.
But come on, guys.
Get out.
Ooh, tennis court.
So we decided to meet at a tennis court instead. This started the tennis court oath. No one could leave the court until a new constitution for France had been written. It was the morning of July 14, 1789, and there was gossip within the commoners that King Louis had ordered troops to Paris and Versailles in case he needed to preserve the monarchy by force. This made us scared, so as a result, the prison of Bastille was raided so that we could obtain gunpowder and rifles. This was the start of the French Revolution. I remember waking in the morning, hearing loud, angry voices. I went outside to ask the townspeople what all the commotion was about. They said that the people in the higher class of the Third Estate was going to the Bastille. I wasn't part of the higher class in the Third Estate, like the bourgeoisie, so I remained behind. The mob tried to negotiate with the commander for weapons, but it didn't work, so they decided to storm into the prison and kill the commander. After the chaos, I was surprised at what they had done. As a member of the Third Estate, I still supported them, but I never knew that so much violence was going to be used. I was also scared for the people that stormed into Bastille, because the king could punish them and end the revolution.
Oh my gosh, my own people.
A person that helped start the revolution was a guy named Emmanuel Joseph Sees. In his pamphlet, he outlined the desires and frustrations of the alienated class of people that made up the Third Estate. A few days after the storming of Bastille, things started changing drastically. The National Assembly began transforming centuries of the French tradition, founded a new government, and made France's monarchy crumble. On August 4th, the National Assembly eliminated all the feudal dues and services that the peasants owned landowners and eliminated the First Estate's legal privileges. That was the best thing that has ever happened to me in years. Finally, no more feudal dues that we had to worry about. We could finally maybe have a better life without hunger and desperateness. No more eating cold stale bread for dinner and giving our precious money away. For once, I remember feeling hope on that day. Fortunately, things started getting better. On August 26th, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This stated that all men were born equal and remain equal before the law and guaranteed freedom of speech, the press, and religion. This boosted up my confidence and I finally felt like an actual citizen in my country. Finally, I had a voice that could be heard, but we were still poor and my family was still starving. On October 5th, my wife and a crowd of 7,000 women marched through the rain from Paris to Versailles demanding bread. Many women from the Third Estate were in the crowd. I suggested to my wife not to go, but days were passing and the children were getting hungrier. Unfortunately, the National Assembly didn't always benefit the country. For example, on November 2nd, the National Assembly seized church lands and sold them to pay off France's huge debt. Religious orders were also disbanded and passed an act that turned the clergy into public employees. Even though it paid off our country's debt, I was horrified. As a Catholic myself, I didn't want church lands being sold off. For our own sins and mess, we had to sell God's gift. Of course, the First Estate was outraged by this, but I do believe they should experience how it feels for someone to take away their privileges, because that's exactly how I felt every day of my entire life. Besides the choice that the National Assembly made to seize church lands, the National Assembly's act changed the whole body of France and helped my life to gain a better future. After the passing Constitution of 1791, the National Assembly dissolved and passed the government to the Legislative Assembly on October the 1st, 1791.
Farewell. So long.
This made me scared because what if the Legislative Assembly wanted to change things? But I was wrong. The Legislative Assembly turned things around. I was happy for once in how the country was advancing. They had brought hope and optimism to the citizens of France despite their conflict with Congress. Citizens gained broad visiting rights, but only the tax-paying men that were at least 25 years old had the rights. Oh, dang! Why am I 32? The Legislative Assembly decided to keep the monarchy, but severely restricted the king's power. This was a relief for me because the last thing I wanted was for the king to have power. For once, it seemed that relations in France were getting peaceful, but Austria and Prussia issued a declaration warning against harming the French monarchs and hinting that any such action would provoke war. Although the declaration was not meant to be read as a serious threat, Austria sent 50,000 troops to the French border with Duke of Brunswick in command.
We're declaring war.
It's too tired.
Due to this, there was a financial strain of war, food shortages, high price, and foreign troops marching towards the city that led to unrest. There were less food for the Third Estate again. Like many people, I was furious with the king because I thought the king was the cause of the army's defeat. It felt like my old life again. I feared that the achievements of the revolution would be overturned soon and thought maybe I had nothing to lose from extreme action. However, I thought about it again and decided I still had a family that I had to care for. I couldn't risk myself getting jailed or killed. My family needed me. Even though I kept quiet, it didn't stop the other commoners. On August the 10th, 1792, a mob marched on the Tuileries Palace and slaughtered the guards. King Louis, Marie Antoinette, and the children were demoted to the commoners and thrown into prison. I couldn't believe that angry commoners could actually imprison the most powerful people in our country. This was when I started feeling fear on our own actions. I always used to fear the government and their choices, but now I started questioning my own people's movements. Even my neighbors, we were peasants, with very little power against the most powerful person in the country. Faced with mob violence and foreign invasion, the Legislative Assembly felt powerless. It voted itself out of existence and called for the election of a new legislature. The National Convention on September 20th, 1793.
National Convention! Come to my place!
I was glad that the Legislative Assembly signed itself out because they've caused enough mess. But I started getting frustrated and worried. What if France will never get a government that can bring peace to France? I grew wary of the National Convention, but their first acts were pleasing to the people. They abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. This gave me a relief because now there will be no more trouble between the king. This could prevent anger growing within the people. I was also glad that the National Convention supported revolution. I just hope that wouldn't get too far. The struggles between two opposing revolutionary factions, the Montagnards and the Girondins, dominated the face of the convention. The Montagnards favored granting the poorer classes more political power, while the Girondins favored a bourgeoisie republic and wanted to reduce the power of Paris over the course of the revolution. The French Republic had three periods: Girondin, Montagnard, or Jacobin, and Thermidorian. A short while after the National Convention was convened, the king was in trial. I knew the king had done wrong, but I actually wished that he wouldn't be executed. It was all unnecessary bloodshed. However, the Montagnards wanted the king to be killed. On January 21st, 1793, the king was scheduled to die. The guillotine was relentless, killing anyone who stood in its way. I remember being one of the many people who watched the king being executed. This reminded me of how rapidly our culture is changing. After the king's execution, the National Convention tightened its hold on France by setting up the Committee of Public Safety to manage the country's military defense against the foreign forces on France's border. So they drafted unmarried men between ages 18 and 45. The National Convention also established a court called the Revolutionary Tribunal that was supposed to eliminate people who threatened the revolution within. Starting from here, I felt like things were going wrong and getting a bit out of hand. Soon the revolution not only tried transforming the government but French society. Leaders of the government wanted to erase all connections to old ways of life by making the clergy members lose their positions and closing churches.
What happened?
Not only that, but a guy named Maximilien Robespierre, who led the National Convention, created the supreme being that worshipped revolution instead of the Roman Catholic. I was furious and concerned about the course of the revolution. It was getting way too serious to the point where even Christ was forgotten and replaced. From that day on, people weren't allowed to worship God. Statues of people holding Bibles were not even safe. I had to throw away all the Bibles in my house and warn my children that they should not talk about God.
Don't read the Bible. You're gonna get caught and thrown into jail.
Workers changed the title on the Bible to Declaration of the Rights of Man. A new calendar was made, and metric systems replaced old systems of weights and measures. When we peasants wanted the goal of ending feudal dues and change back being devoutly Catholic and started opposing revolution's anti-clerical moves publicly. When the National Convention instituted draft, we erupted in hatred. Villages, including my own, rebelled, and I remember declaring, "They have killed our king, chased away our priests, sold the goods of our church, eaten everything we have, and now they want to take our bodies. No, they shall not have it." Mountain leaders, who were the most radical, used the Revolutionary Tribunal to aid any resistance to revolution. Robespierre also declared the need to use terror to defend the Republic from its many enemies. I hated Robespierre by now. He wasn't using his power for good, and the only enemy from this country was him. He was turning the country into a mayhem, causing too much blood to be shed in France. However, not only was Robespierre causing trouble, but Jean-Paul Marat was an advocate of violence and was one of the most radical leaders. The Revolutionary Tribunal started a campaign stating that anyone who criticized or who had connection to old people would be hauled for trial. The slaughter was merciless, killing people from any particular class, occupation, or gender. The killing escalated and killed both the guilty and innocent. A lot of my neighbors who criticized the Revolutionary Tribunal were dragged away from their homes and soon executed by the guillotine. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was executed, and a few days after came a nightmare. I remember soldiers breaking in our house at midnight, dragging my wife away from my children and I, waking up all the neighbors. My wife was being sent for trial for complaining about the high price of bread. A police spy overheard my wife complaining while she was in the bread line. One day later, I stood before the guillotine holding my children's hands and watched my wife getting executed. On that day, my hope for the country was broken.
A few months later, I guess Robespierre finally realized that things were going wrong, so he sent his followers and George Jack Danton, who is popular with the Republic, to suggest that the rule of terror to relax.
The rules should relax.
No. However, the National Convention declared him an outlaw, so when Robespierre received the word, he shot himself in the head, but only succeeded in wounding his jaw. The next day, the National Convention arrested him, and Robespierre and about 100 of his supporters died by the guillotine. Robespierre now will never have an opportunity to address the convention. This gave me a relief. I made sure I was there for his execution so that I could know that it was his fault. During the 10 months of terror, 30,000 people were arrested and about 17,000 were executed. It was a widespread violence that shocked many people in France and increased foreign opposition against the revolution. Finally, after the horrible terror ended, the National Convention wrote another constitution, 1795. By now, my hope was shattered and I didn't really care what happened to my country. My wife was dead, I was still a peasant. Even though it did help us obtain more rights and equal representation, I didn't care about that anymore. But you know what was the worst thing? I felt guilt upon this whole mess. I couldn't blame this whole terror on one person, because I knew part of it was created by my own people and myself. The Directory restricted voting rights, giving in the new preview constitution. Now only men who owned property could vote. I was one of the few peasants that owned a small plot of land, so that I could vote. My voice could be actually heard. This did encourage me, and it showed that I wasn't only a peasant, but a citizen in France that mattered. The National Convention officially ended on October 26, 1795, and the governing board was called Directory, and that it was made up of 5 men called Directors. There were also 2 legislative bodies called the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500. The Directory tried to prove to the people that it was true to ideals, and that Robespierre's state of terror was wrong. To me and many people, the Directory wasn't a real republic. The members of the Directory weren't elected into position, but were appointed by members within the organization. The people didn't have a say, and we couldn't until the first round of elections. However, the directors did pass some financial reforms that helped farmers and improved trade. This did help my life a little, because we could get more food with a better price. I still had a child to feed, so I was thankful for this reform. I can't remember the last time I could finally have 3 meals a day. But still, the Directory was not an effective government, because the directors were weak and corrupt, and of course, France's troubles continued. I was expecting this because every legislative in France never turned out well. The directors argued among themselves, failing this country. Eventually, their rule had many characteristics of the old orders, like the high prices, bankruptcy, and citizen unrest. Slowly, I felt that France was turning into its old self again before the revolution. With no one in control, I waited for a new constitution that would benefit and change France, without failure. The revolution was a nightmare in France that haven't helped France reach its dream, a dream for a nation to have peace and equalness. Even though it did help us obtain more rights and more equal representation, nobody thought it would have turned out like this. I realized that my optimism had left after the French Revolution. Normally, I would hope for the best, but after many disappointments from the legislative government, my faith decreased. It may just be an event to some people that didn't actually experience it, but it was more for us. The revolution to me was a nightmare. I lost my wife, I've seen many people die, but I can't change things. I'm a citizen of this country, and the only thing I can do right now is dream for a better life and a better country. Now I know why my parents called me Ad-Ream. I was their dream to them, a dream with a country with liberty.
I'm French.
It is time for us all to decide who we are. Do we fight for the right to a night at the opera now? Have you asked of yourselves what's the price you might pay? Is it simply a game for rich young boys to play?